Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Scientia, and thank you for joining us here today. I'm David Queller from the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and this year's program chair for Scientia. I'm standing in as Master of Ceremonies today for Jim Pomerantz, who is in Portugal. He wanted me to assure you that he's presenting a paper there and not simply playing hooky. He would have been delighted to be here today. This is our second lecture of our series this year, a series that I think you'll find very interesting and perhaps a little disquieting. Our theme for this year is conflict, violence, and war. Today we're fortunate to have one of Rice's top historians in Professor Martin Wiener to address us, and it will be my pleasure to introduce him in just a moment. But first, a little bit of background information. All of you have heard this if you've been to Scientia talks before, but some of you will be new, and let me explain a little bit about us. Scientia is an institute for the study of the history of science and culture. It was founded in 1981 by Solomon Bachner at Rice and has continued ever since. Scientia's aim is to present speakers and programs for the widest audience, for Rice faculty, students, staff, alumni, as well as our colleagues from other institutions in town. One of our main goals is to provide an opportunity for scholarly discussion that transcends the usual academic boundaries. And in particular, we aim to bridge that famous C.P. Snow two cultures gap between the humanities and sciences. So as I mentioned this year, our theme is conflict, violence, and war. Last month, Professor Joan Strassman of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology kicked off our series with a wonderful talk on violence in animals. If you think I'm biased about that, and I can't imagine why you might think that, you can confirm it for yourself. Her talk either is or will soon be available as a webcast from Scientia's webpage. For copyright reasons, the videos she showed are omitted from there, which is a shame because you'll miss the context of some interesting double entendres. But it's still well worth a visit. Now, except for the Bachner lecture, we have the rest of our program fully scheduled for this year. The next talk will be on November 16th when David Cook from Religious Studies will talk to us on the topical theme of jihad. Later on, we'll hear from Rick Stoll in Political Science, Kirsten Oster from English, Rick Wilson, also from Political Science, and David Schneider of Psychology. A little bit on the format today. After Professor Wiener's talk, we will have a short commentaries by two panelists. We have Rick Stoll from the Political Science Department, who can offer us, he'll incidentally be one of our later speakers, offer us a perspective from political science, and Rand Nisbet, a visiting professor in the Anthropology Department, who can bring us a biological or cross-cultural perspective. They'll offer just a couple minutes comments, give you time to think up your questions for the period which follows an opening question period, and after that we'll have refreshments outside here. So our speaker today is Martin Wiener, who is the Mary Gibbs Jones Professor of History at Rice. He has his BA from Brandeis and PhD from Harvard University and has been here ever since. Professor Wiener works on various aspects of the history of the British Empire. He's written numerous articles and at least 4 books, several of which bear directly on the theme that we're talking about today. So I'll just read a couple of those titles. One is Reconstructing the Criminal, Culture, Law, and Policy in England, 1830 to 1914. His recent book is Men of Blood, Violence, Manliness, and Criminal Justice in Victorian England. And he tells me he's currently working on another book called An Empire of Law, Violence, Race, and Authority in the British Empire. Now, in addition to several awards for his books, Professor Wiener has accumulated quite a list of distinctions, of which I'll mention just a subset. He is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He is editor of a series called Crime and Punishment in England, 1850 to 1922. He is past president of the North American Conference on British Studies, has been a fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and one that particularly caught my attention in the context of Scientia, he's been a recipient of a National Science Foundation grant. It strikes me that if you're in the humanities, of all the ways to bridge that C.P. Snow gap, dipping into the science pots of money must be among the most difficult and the most gratifying. So, as always, let me ask you to turn off your pagers and your beepers and your other noisemakers so that we can all turn our attention to Professor Martin Wiener, who will talk to us today about violence in history.
Thanks, David. The thing I did enjoy the most about the NSF grant was being able to tell my Dean of Humanities that I was bringing in overhead, which is something humanist doesn't get to do. Well, my title, of course, is ridiculously vast, and I will be limiting my range somewhat today. I'll be basically talking about Western Europe and North America from about the 16th century to the present, which already for a historian is pretty big, and focusing on interpersonal violence, which has been my specialty for some time, in scholarship, naturally. Let me start, though, with a story, a true story, naturally, since I'm a historian. One day in 1573, Sir John Fortescue, a rich and quarrelsome landowner, was walking with several attendants in Fleet Street, London. As they passed a crossbow maker's shop, out swarmed the 14th Earl of Wilton with 12 followers, who attacked them from behind. The Earl struck Fortescue to the ground, and as passersby scattered, continued to rain blows with his truncheon as the man lay senseless on the ground, until additional servants of Fortescue arrived. Fortescue survived, but had some permanent injuries. No criminal charges were filed. This scene, more appropriate to The Sopranos than to the quaint London of Shakespeare in Love, was not all that out of the ordinary. Sudden violence was a frequent occurrence in Renaissance England and practiced by those of high station equally with those of low. Men of importance went about with bodyguards and saw nothing dishonorable in attacking by surprise with superior forces, or in attacking from behind, or hitting a man when he was down. Deadly weapons were ready to hand. The poet, Philip Sidney, warned his father's secretary that if he read his letters to his father again, quote, "I will thrust my dagger into you, and trust to it, for I speak in earnest." Such moments from the past remind us that peaceable England has not always been that way, and more generally that interpersonal violence has a history. The amount and the character of such violence has changed over time, and quite dramatically so. Here, today, I'm really going to be making two large points. One, and this really connects back with Joan Strassman's talk last time, is that human history is part of the natural world, and that just as intraspecies killing is an extremely common occurrence in the natural world, the same thing is true with humans. The human species is also, you might say, naturally violent. Violence against other humans is perfectly understandable in evolutionary terms and still remains with us. On the other hand, I also want to show how, if natural, this inclination to violence is also and has been highly variable in amount and in character, open to various influences in history. So I really want us to take a look today at how these two kinds of influences of nature and culture have actually worked out in practice. And I start with nature because this is something that historians have shied away from. Historians have usually hated to see any intrusion, as they would see it, of the relatively new science of evolutionary psychology into history. It's usually characterized as either a pseudoscience, usually termed sociobiology, a veiled, not really a science, but a political ideology, a conservative political ideology that pretends to be a science, or simply more specifically as just anti-historical, because it it deals with, at least fixed, at least in historical time, fixed universals rooted in human nature, and tends to end up by saying, things like you can't change human nature. But this prejudice, which I think it is, of historians against evolutionary thinking and evolutionary psychology in particular, I think is beginning to wane. And a few historians are beginning to see that it's not a question of either or, but of drawing on both biological and sociocultural perspectives. There is no fundamental break, after all, in human history. There's no break between evolutionary time, when natural selection ruled, and cultural time, say from around 50,000, 60,000 years ago onward, or the closer time of written records, what used to be known as officially history, from 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. The nature inherited from earlier time continued into, you might say, cultural time or historical time. And this, of course, is obvious physically, but it's also true behaviorally. Behavior is more malleable, usually, than physical attributes, but not indefinitely malleable. Thus, behind history's continual and ever faster changes lie some persistent natural structures of behavior, a legacy with which the history of human culture begins. And today, we're looking at one particular structure of behavior, and that is violence, the inclinations to violence between individuals, particularly, as well as the more collective forms that are behind war. Just as in other species, violence has survived in humans as a strategy because it has often been functional for reproductive success, of course. But similarly, as in fact Joan was pointing out in her talk, like other animals, it's also been natural among humans to develop ways of limiting or avoiding violence, which would be dysfunctional. Another important natural, you might say, foundation of violence among humans is that violence is gendered, naturally gendered. Both kinds of violence, so you might say organized and disorganized violence, have been predominantly carried out by men. Evolutionary psychology predicts that also. Males in the human species, as in most species, need, of course, to gain sexual access to females and deny other males sexual access. And violence is often, or the reputation of violence is often a very good strategy. And in a more general sense, males have been prone to more high-risk behavior than females. So that the historical record bears out the natural basis of violence. Despite efforts, neither historians nor anthropologists have been able to find a society without both forms of violence, or a society in which women predominate in violent behavior. They just don't exist. In Western history, in the history that we have some good, reliable records for, say, Western Europe and America from 1600 or so onward, the male share of officially recognized homicides, and here I'm taking, in effect, homicides or recorded homicides as a kind of marker for violence, because it's the most reliable, even though, of course, there are lots of problems with it, most reliable marker that we have. In Europe and America, over these past 400 years, the male share of homicides of adults has ranged between 75 and 95%, and possibly even higher in reality, since many homicides committed by females turn out, upon closer investigation, just as today, to have been essentially defensive or responding to violence by a male. And the interesting thing is that over the centuries, there's been very little change in the gender ratio. A lot of things have changed in different societies, but every single one of them, males have been overwhelmingly the perpetrators of homicide, of adults. Fortunately, however, for all this consistency in human history, there's also been a great variation. A variation in the amount of violence. We'll be taking homicide usually as a marker. The amount of homicide and the character of homicide. Why? Well, of course, culture. The cultural factor enters in, and culture has introduced tremendous possibilities of altering this basic natural inclinations. And such variation, of course, has been recognized by the more sensible evolutionary psychologists, Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, who in 1988 wrote a very interesting book called Homicide, which was the first effort to apply evolutionary psychology to understanding homicide in human societies, and particularly in contemporary human society. They observed that the enormous variability in national homicide rates should be grounds for optimism. There are social milieus, they wrote, where killing is exceedingly rare. And thus, hopefully, their conditions could be duplicated, and there's no reason why killing can't become exceedingly rare generally. And specifically, they mentioned on the violence against wives, which has become a particularly prominent kind of homicide in our time, which essentially they trace to male sexual proprietariness. They observed that it may be the case that men have proprietary inclinations toward their wives everywhere, but they do not feel equally entitled to act upon them everywhere. So my work has largely been on individual, interpersonal violence. And in fact, it's been part of a large, almost explosion of scholarship, historical scholarship, in the last 20 years or so on the history of crime and the history of violence. Why, in the last 20 years or so, has there been so much interest? Well, I think part of the answer goes back to the rise of social history and the rise of quantitative history in the last few decades. And crime and violence are particularly part of social history and amenable often to quantitative techniques. And also, of course, to the fact that in the past generation, there's been a large increase in crime, and particularly in violent crime. And so people have become much more interested in the subject than they once were. And this historical scholarship has shown us for the first time that not only violence had certain things about it have persisted, like its gendered character, but also that certain things have changed quite dramatically. And one obvious thing that has changed is that there has been a long-term decline in the amount of homicide, the amount of interpersonal violence in Europe and America since the Middle Ages, or at least since the 16th century. And geographically, it's interesting. This pattern of decline, this long-term decline that only now have historians really mapped by dozens and dozens of specific studies of specific locations. This decline began in England and the Netherlands, just where we might expect it to in terms of other attributes of modernity. Began in England and the Netherlands in the 17th century and spread in all directions from there. There was also a long-term change in the character of violence. If you think back on Sir John Fortescue and the Earl of Wilton, one of the things that has changed most sharply is that violence, which used to be, and homicides, which used to be as likely to be perpetrated by upper-class individuals as lower class, has now become very heavily confined to lower class The upper classes have abandoned it. Violence used to be much more likely to be committed by groups against other groups or against individuals. This has changed. Homicidal violence is far more likely to be an individual act. And finally, violence used to be more likely, homicides used to be more likely to be carried on in public and more likely to involve men killing men. Nowadays, a much higher proportion of homicide is private and men killing women. In the Middle Ages, in medieval England, about 10% of homicides, recorded homicides, were domestic or intimate homicide. In 1900 in England, about half were, from 10% to half, while the overall homicide rate in 1900 England was about 1/10 of that of the Middle Ages. Another interesting thing has been that this long, centuries-long decline of interpersonal violence seems to have come to a sharp end and, in fact, been reversed in our lifetimes. Starting in the early 1960s and running for about a generation, there was, as we're all familiar with, a sharp reversal of the centuries-long trend. There was a sharp increase in homicides. And this was also shared by Europe and America. And then finally, there's been an end to this sharp rise and a renewed fall, only very recently in the 1990s. So we don't really know yet if this is going to continue or not. Now, the trends in Europe and America have been similar to some degree, except that in America, the whole level has been higher. The U.S. homicide rate, as we're all familiar with, always has been much higher than in Western Europe. There's been this degree of American exceptionalism in violence, or at least in homicidal violence. And it's interesting to see that at every point in history, this has been true. But particularly, it turns out, the high American rate is something that we can trace a little more precisely. In the mid-19th century, in Western Europe, homicide rates started sharply going down. In America, they failed to turn. They failed to go down. So that by the 1920s, the contrast between Western Europe and the United States was at its greatest. In the 1920s, the homicide rate in the United States was about 15 times that of England. Now, actually, things have changed quite a bit. And it's down to only 4 to 5 times greater than England. So there is an interesting phenomenon going on there. And why there should be this American difference, I'll come back to in a minute. Why, however, this is the most interesting what I wanted to present. But the question then becomes, of course, why was this happening? Why was there this centuries-long decline in violence, in homicidal violence? Historians have particularly, seeking an answer for this, have been particularly impressed by one person's theories in particular. Norbert Elias, E-L-I-A-S, a German Jewish emigre who got to Switzerland in 1938, published in 1939 in German a book called On the Civilizing Process. Nobody paid much attention to it. Of course, in 1939, people had other things to be concerned about, until it was translated into English in 1968, when people began to read it, and with a renewed interest in the 70s now in things like the history of violence, began to read it and think about it. For Elias, the key thing that happened in early modern history was the rise of the state, with its determination to monopolize violence. This and suppress aristocratic violence. This, of course, is somewhat familiar, but what Elias pointed out and explored was the psychological consequences of the rise of the state. On the one hand, the state's monopolization of violence deprived individuals of socially accepted outlets for the aggressive impulses and made it necessary for them to learn how to control their impulses and their emotions. But more subtly, the rise of the state and its bureaucratic centralization, as Elias put it, lengthens the chains of social interdependence, which require, as he put it, foresight, more complex self-discipline, more stable superego formation. Increasing differentiation of social functions, he argued, produced increased differentiation within the personality. So that this continual necessity to control one's affect gradually, and these external constraints, increasingly internalized, gradually produced a different kind of personality over a long period of time. A personality, a kind of inner-directed, self-directing, self-controlling, self-monitoring personality in which these controls have become second nature and are not even, the original origins have been lost. So that the decline in violence Elias saw as part of a larger social trend. He wasn't even primarily interested in violence. A larger shift towards increased self-control of affect and emotion and impulse. The same kind of new personality emerging that would also be less likely to get drunk or be reckless and careless and so forth, and learn better manners. And he spends time talking about table manners and methods of defecation and so forth that all have to be carefully controlled. In a sense here, and his mentioning of the term superego gives a hint to it. What Elias did in a way was historicize Freud. The superego, the heavy conscience that Freud saw in turn-of-the-century Vienna, making life difficult for humans, Elias saw as the product of centuries of a particular specific historical development, rather than some fundamental part of the human personality. But Elias's model seemed extremely attractive, but historians, began to feel that this was not complete, and various people have tried to add on and show the ways in which we need to see more forces working in the same direction, not just the state. That there was a variety of disciplining institutional arrangements emerging in Europe and America over the last several centuries that were all working in the same direction, both unintended and intended. Unintended. Increasing independence was promoted also by economic change. All the various changes that we lump together as capitalism, industrialism, technological development, urbanization, were all working to change individual personality towards a greater degree of self-monitoring and self-discipline. Even rising literacy seems to have helped individuals self-manage feelings. At the same time, there were intentional developments. A civilizing offensive was also underway, as well as an unintended, impersonal civilizing process. A civilizing offensive carried out, for example, by industrialists on their employees, to make them more sensitive to time, to regulate themselves better, to work in a more modern, efficient way, people to begin to wear watches that would keep them monitoring their use of time, educators training people in this new phenomenon of universal elementary education, but also training people in little children in learning to come to school on time and so forth and so on, and think about organizing their impulses. Religious moral reformers, and also the law, because the last few hundred years of Western history has seen a shift in criminal justice towards an increasing inclination to monitor and punish violent behavior. And you can see, for example, this being spread elsewhere. The spread of European empires throughout the world often carried these inclinations, and the civilizing offensive in particular with it. One example from the British Empire, let me mention. In the Ionian Islands of Greece, British authorities over just a few decades in the mid-19th century destroyed a traditional, and no doubt within its terms highly functional, culture of ritual knife fighting, which led to a rather high death rate. British stopped it. And in fact, it was interesting because after this, the Ionians, just as in Renaissance England, took to litigation. There was a tremendous spike in litigation, as there was in 17th century England, as presumably a nonviolent way to carry on the same conflicts over status and interests. So lawyers do serve some function. Also, there's possible, and this, of course, might be controversial, but there may well have also been some biological natural selection effect over several centuries. As the social and political changes were made violent propensities somewhat less successful, they were probably, to some degree, less passed on by inheritance. Now, clearly, there hasn't been enough time for this to be a major influence, but it probably was a contributory factor at some level. But then we come, of course, to this problem I mentioned I would come back to of why is America different? Why is the homicide level in America so much higher? The same trends seem to operate of a long decline, except America's was delayed. As I mentioned, in the mid-19th century, it didn't go down the way Europe's did. But then it did in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. There was a big, so to speak, kind of American catching up, sharp decline in homicides. But still, ending up at a much higher level. Well, there's a number of explanations. Of course, the most obvious, we might say, is the availability of guns, the vast number of guns, which means also that the majority of American homicides are committed by gun, which is not true elsewhere since guns are less available. But then, of course, when the availability of guns just puts the question back another step towards culture, and why are guns more available? Because clearly there's a different culture in America. And there's a greater degree, clearly, of legal and cultural tolerance for the individual use of lethal violence. Now, this is not necessarily a completely bad thing. It's been pointed out that there is a kind of trade-off, that America is a looser, freer society than many others, and that part of this may come from a greater tolerance of even individual violence. In general, individual doing things and being less regulated by the authorities. Nonetheless, there clearly is in the law, and American law is different. American law, in English law, for example, and of course America and England share the same fundamental legal structures and inheritance. But in English law, in the 18th century and the early 19th century, as the American colonies were separating, the principle emerged clearly that an individual threatened by someone else, or someone else was coming after him with violence, had a duty to retreat. If he fought back and killed the aggressor, it would not be justified homicide unless he had no choice, unless there was no place for him to go. He couldn't leave the scene. In American law, this is not true. In American law, it was decided clearly in the 19th century that a man has no duty to retreat. If somebody attacks him, he's justified in fighting back and killing the person. So you can see that behind the law is cultural attitudes. Similarly, of course, in America, there's greater jury sympathy for defendants who've used violence in defense of their person, or even sometimes in defense of their property. Shooting a burglar will get you convicted in England of an offense. Shooting a burglar in America, of course, will not. So there's a different attitude towards the employment of force. And in America, it's often been traced, this greater tolerance has been traced to both the Southern heritage of a Southern culture of honor, a Southern institution of slavery, which after all was fundamentally based on violence, and the other American legacy of the West, a weak society, a weak state where individuals often had to protect themselves or nobody was around to protect them. So that even today, American culture is still marked by these inheritances. And in fact, there's a wonderful comparative study that was done, very surprising, to show you the degree of the ways in which the civilizing process, in the strict sense of control of affect and feelings about using violence, have been internalized more in Europe than in America. In 1990, 33% of English murderers, after their murder, they took their own lives. In Denmark, this figure reached 42%. In the United States, it was 4%. It actually, I don't know what it's for 2000. I need to find out. But the study I was reading was using the 1990 figures. I've got to find this out because, in fact, it would be a very hopeful sign if American murderers were increasingly killing themselves. And then again, why now? Why was there a reversal of this centuries-long trend? Now that it's been established, and we've got lots of charts showing this down, 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 fluctuations, but basically it's always going down, down, until, as I say, the early 1960s. And then, in America, in Canada, in Western Europe, turns back up. And it goes up quite sharply for a generation. Why? Well, here now, the closer you get to the present, the less easy it is to understand or explain anything. There are various possible explanations, of course, that have been put forward. Demography is one, the explosion in the number of young people. And of course, just as violence is gendered, it's also aged, in that in every society, a disproportionate amount of interpersonal violence is carried out by men and also by young men. And so there was a lot more young men suddenly available in the 60s and 70s than there had been before. And then, of course, there are cultural explanations. The 60s was the classic era of the discrediting of authority. And this was also perhaps the beginnings of a great explosion of glorifying of violence in the media. There were also economic explanations. The increasing availability of powerful drugs, increasing immigration. One thing about increasing immigration, particularly of unskilled people, is that it's mostly men. It's mostly young men. It's mostly just the kind of people who are most likely to be violent. So it's increasing the violence-prone population. And this was happening in Europe just as it was happening in the United States. And, of course, then other economic arguments, decline of job opportunities for the unskilled with technological change, leaving more unskilled young men, poor young men, particularly minorities, Afro-American and so forth, with fewer options, more likely, therefore, to seek out violent options. So there are lots of explanations. We don't fully understand it. And also, of course, another explanation is criminal justice policy. Because I was talking about the civilizing offensive. Well, by the early 1960s, the civilizing offensive had largely waned. It had been successful enough that criminal justice policy had become less oppressive, you might say. There were greater restrictions being put on police and prosecution. Punishments were being reduced in length and severity. Punishments that, were becoming less deterrent, less incapacitating, less symbolically punitive. All of these are factors, I think, that fed into the decline of this new upsurge of violence. And then finally, this post-1990 renewed decline of violence. What caused that? This is, of course, so recent that it's really an open question. Nonetheless, I think these long-term shifts have some implications for social policy. One implication is simply that any social policies can only do so much. There are limitations. Impersonal social forces, as we can see operating over the centuries, have a great deal to do with the amount of violence in a society. And that's going to happen anyway. Nonetheless, it's also true, I think, that seeing what's happened over the last few centuries and getting some sense of why also shows us that deliberate public policies do have some influence. Because a key part of the civilizing process everywhere over the past few centuries were deliberate state policies, both spreading education, and education not just in teaching people knowledge, giving people knowledge or skills, but also education in the sense of social control, implanting various shaping personalities. And also, of course, social policy in the sense of criminal policy and instituting efforts to apprehend, punish, deter crimes of violence. All of these things have gone on and have been characteristic of the long decline in violence and have probably all played their role in this long decline. So that, to some degree, we can see that they've been largely successful. There's much less violence, interpersonal violence today than people used to have to live with. But on the other hand, we can, on the one hand, afford to ease off, perhaps. On the other hand, we can't afford to forget about this either. We should not swing pendulum so far as to think that, to some degree of concern about deterring and punishing crimes of violence are no longer necessary. So, what do I come to in the end of this sweep through centuries? A number of conclusions, I think. First, that human violence needs to be understood in a long time frame and embracing both nature and culture, both evolutionary time and historical time. And second, that the history of interpersonal violence is one of both universality and variation, both of continuity and of change. Third, that the single most important thing about the history of interpersonal violence has probably been the 300 years plus long decline in the West. Fourth, more recent fluctuations, harder to explain. We're going to need probably greater distance, perspective of distance, to understand what is happening now. Where are we in this long story? Is the decline over? Are we back on track now in the last few years? Was the 60s to the early 90s a blip? Or did it make a fundamental change in direction? And I think we can have a sense of hopefulness about interpersonal violence. Because for all its rootedness in biology, for all the fact that is an essential, a rooted, wired-in attribute of human beings and their nature, interpersonal violence has proved highly amenable to control and to redirection. And while it will probably never be eliminated, there's no reason why it can't be further reduced. Now, organized violence, on the other hand, large-scale collective violence such as carried out by states or even sub-states, ethnic groups or terrorist groups history provides a less hopeful picture. The historical record doesn't seem to show any similar pattern of progress. But that I'll have to leave to a future talk, probably by Rick Stoll. So thank you.
I'm going to call now on our panelists, and you can all be thinking of your questions slowly, but Rick Stoll will have to think of his quickly. Put him on the spot right now.
Thank you. A quick observation and then a quick question. And unfortunately, I did not read the study. I read about it. But there was at least one study that claimed that the decline in murder rates that we've seen recently is the result of better medical treatment by EMTs in the emergency rooms. And so the number of actions may not have declined, but people are surviving it, and I think it would be interesting to follow that up. There is a form of interpersonal violence that I think has pretty much disappeared from civilized society, and that's dueling. You know, there was a time when, of course, that wasn't even, I suppose, considered to be a crime, and I wondered if the lag between the United States and Europe that you see in homicides also occurs in dueling. That's my question.
Should I just? Okay, might as well just do it. Right. Yeah, actually, dueling is kind of introduced as a way, as part of the civilizing offensive to reduce violence. What happens, for example, in England is this practice, which had already really gotten going in France in the 16th century. Monarchs like Queen Elizabeth deliberately encouraged dueling. In other words, so that, like the Earl of Wilton, should not attack Fortescue from behind and slug him and so forth with all his helpers, but should challenge him to a duel. And then they can have a nice civilized, just the two of them, and there'd be a lot less mayhem. So actually, it's an example of a move away to control violence, which centuries later once begins to look itself like excessive amounts of violence, and then 100, 200 years later begins to be attacked as awful and violent and barbarous. So that dueling has an interesting role here. Medical care is a very interesting problem nowadays because obviously modern medical care has reduced the homicide rate to some degree. And many of these homicides from a couple hundred years ago, or even in the 19th century, are cases in which the person doesn't die for several days, and you can see, oh well, with modern ER, they could likely have saved the person. So this, of course, this is one of the great problems. Historical measurers have a lot of problems, and this is one of them. On the other hand, of course, not only are guns more common now than they used to be, but they're much more efficient. So there are also many cases of people trying to shoot somebody in the 19th century and the gun doesn't function. Or they shoot him, but he doesn't kill them. It's a lot of times people are shot, and or shot several times, but it's so inefficient that they're shot a little in the leg and they're grazed over here. So it's nowadays, I think, guns are much more efficient. So it's a race between medical care and efficient. It's a technological arms race.
Rand Nisbet.
Yeah, just a comment. I don't know a great deal about violence. I have been working in West Africa for the past 15 years where many of you know there's been some disastrous and tragic civil conflicts in Sierra Leone and Liberia. So most of my introduction to violence is not as a biological anthropologist or a cultural anthropologist, but rather as a humanitarian. And I know that you focused pretty much on well, almost exclusively on interpersonal violence. I wondered if you would care to speculate on taking that to the group level, because in fact violence is carried out by individuals, and certainly some of the heinous things and horrendous things that we've seen recently in the 60s or since the 60s really have been directed against non-combatants, against individuals that don't make a lot of sense. I wondered if you could comment on that perhaps to take it to the group level from the individual level. And then one final comment. I have a good friend that works in Liberia with me from the Netherlands, and I asked him once if there was anything that was illegal in the Netherlands, and he said only guns. So it was interesting with regard to your point that you had a movement in England and the Netherlands very early on with regard to this early decline in homicide. And So would you care to speculate on taking interpersonal level on the interpersonal violence on the individual level to a group level for what we see in failed states, for one thing?
Yeah, well, I think one important thing to remember that in fact, evolutionary perspective does give us that it's not a total answer, but that human beings do always have the potential for violence. And, of course, we've seen this in so many ways, but that, in fact, it's not surprising because in so many ways in the past, earlier human times, it was functional. And thus, the potential is there. Now, how societies can use it to set it off or to prevent it then becomes very much a kind of cultural and political question. But almost anybody, I think, has that potential in them that goes back a long way. And that it's a necessary, you might say, at least it was a necessary potential to have. But it's also, as I was saying, so much more difficult to deal with than simple interpersonal violence within a society.
Thank you. Let's open it up to questions from the floor now. It would be great if I could have a volunteer from each side to shuttle the microphones around so that we can all hear the questions, if anybody's willing to do that. I've got microphones that will pass around. It's turned on already.
Since violence is cultural and we also have that within ourselves, to what extent is it learned? And is it possible that since so much is being done with DNA, that people in fact have this capability within themselves?
So now I've let myself in for this. I've now not only historian, I've got to be a biologist and a psychologist. But of course, right, DNA, the thing, of course, and I'm sure biologists would say this, is that we're not going to find a gene for violent behavior. It's going to be much more complicated. It's a matter of a variety of different genes interacting in a variety of ways in different environments to produce that. So there isn't going to be any neat little way of eliminating violent propensities in people by manipulating their DNA. Nonetheless, of course, in the long run, who knows what we can do to manipulate human behavior now biologically. Of course, I don't have to deal with this. I only deal with what's happened already. And even though anything I say about implications for the future or what we should do, of course, I can always say, this isn't really what historians do. We're only concerned with everything up to the moment now. So as for the future, almost anything, I suppose, is possible in the manipulation of human behavior.
Can everyone hear me? I can without the mic. But I think this is kind of a follow-up, Marty, to that answer. I mean, without predicting the future, on the other hand, one can look back and see this idea of trying to identify genetic or biological or inheritable propensities to violence and then to somehow control it. So maybe you could talk about that. And also just listening to the radio this morning, Prop 65 or 66 in California is designed, if you are accused of a felony, they will then take your DNA sample, which they will then have in a database, presumably to find you later on when you do commit the felony. But nevertheless, it's quite a striking feature, given that I do think that there's, given the past attempt to identify genetic predisposition to violence, it is, pretty interesting to see that it's a striking possibility to at least look for that in the future, if not necessarily to scientifically be able to do it.
Yeah, no, I think that certainly is, people are going to do more and more. Once this data is available from like all felons' DNA available on file, people will be engaging in studies to see if there's what they can tell is different between these and a general sample from the population. You can see if you can identify the particular markers.
I really enjoyed your talk, and since we are sort of talking about this general issue of, the old nature-nurture debate, I was struck by your sort of implicit theoretical frame, which posed this opposition between nature and culture and the assumption that we are naturally violent and that any variation in that is due to culture. It seems to me that one could easily make the opposite argument, that in fact what's natural is to be peaceful, and variation, violence is
Well, violence is a natural
due to
propensity. A propensity to violence
right,
doesn't
but
mean
I'm just,
actual violence.
Yeah, and I don't
behavior.
want to dispute what's natural and what isn't, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that's an endless debate.
Yeah.
But what I do want to just ask is, what's at stake for you in sort of posing that as a theoretical frame? Because it does seem to me that, well, so I'll tell you what I think is at stake. What it does allow you to do is it allows you to paint this picture of the sort of natural base of violence that is then regulated and monitored by the state, right? And increasingly the state gets better and better at doing that, and so violence declines. But I think that what that does is it also obfuscates all of the ways in which the state gets better and better at perpetrating massive violence in very efficient ways. That it's not about impulse control, right? It's about state-sanctioned violence that, has horrendous effects, and I think can't be separated from the issue of interpersonal violence, right? So I want to tie it back into that sort of nature-culture frame that you began with, because I do think.
But why can't it be separated? See, that's how I, in a way, started by saying that here there's a difference. And in fact, I really can't. The historical record is rather hopeful about interpersonal violence, but it's not. Doesn't seem to be very hopeful about state violence, organized violence. We certainly don't see any record of improvement over time. But they're two different phenomena. And in fact, like Elias's civilizing process model doesn't say anything about that there should be any decrease in state violence. It simply says that this individual, somewhat closer to spontaneous individual violence is being operated on by these processes. But in other words, they are separate. I don't see any reason why they can't be separated, separate phenomena. In other words, the same a society like Nazi Germany could have a very low level, could have a low level of interpersonal violence, and individuals monitoring themselves a great deal, and yet perpetrate a vast amount of. Yeah.
I'm just saying that historically what it does is it paints a picture that can be deceptive, right, about the levels of violence in society. And there are lots of examples of Nazis who did horrible things and who were, really nice to their children, right, and didn't beat their wives. And so.
But if you're interested in interpersonal violence, then you can study interpersonal violence. As long as you're saying that, understand that this isn't saying anything about state violence. In other words, societies can have different levels of state violence while participating in a gradual decline of interpersonal violence.
Yeah, no, and I don't want to take up all the time, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that your conceptual frame is forcing us to create a relationship between interpersonal violence and state violence, because you're posing the state as the civilizing force that controls interpersonal violence. And so I think there is an implicit relationship in the way that you're framing your argument that is connected to the founding opposition that you're posing between nature and culture. And I guess I just want to question that, or just not question it in the sense that it ruins your argument, but just to pose a question about it as something to think about, right? As something to think about, right? So that's all.
I think we had.
A couple of things occurred to me. I just want to mention the American violence in the 19th century, even before, was much higher than in Europe. You also said in a different place that violence as the civilizing mission or whatever came into effect in the state and all that, violence tended to be more among the lower classes than the upper classes. And perhaps since the migration to the United States consisted primarily of lower classes, perhaps that was a factor that made that made the violence in the United States higher. So you did use that argument when you said in the 60s, 70s, you said migration might have some impact on it. So maybe it has some impact in the 17th or 18th, 19th century as well.
Right. Although, if you go that far back, then you find that the upper classes in England are just as violent as the lower classes, and are killing people individually, not in terms of politics. So that their behavior is changing very rapidly over the 17th and 18th centuries as America is being colonized. So there's probably not that much. And in fact, of course, I want to emphasize that the biological factors here are a background, but I was also clearly, if this was simply a matter of people's genes, who's got particularly violent genes, there wouldn't have been this broad decline over centuries. That culture has been increasingly modifying propensities, and not just the state. The state was what Elias focused on, but we've come to see that many other social processes were working in the same direction. It wasn't just the state was making people less violent, but so was urbanization. So was economic development in many ways, and a variety of situations or a variety of forces.
I just want to, this is doubtless statistically completely wrong. However, you did mention that at some date, I forget what it was, that from that date until, at that date, 5% of violence was against women and 95% was done by men, whereas today it's 50% is the violence done against women. And at the same time, you said that between those two dates, the amount of violence in general had dropped to 10%, which sounds to me like it's the same amount of violence against women, but it's dropped substantially among men.
No, actually, it means that the violence against women dropped at a slower rate than men's violence against men. In other words, okay, quick calculation. Violence, you've got 100 homicides, and then they drop to 10 homicides. When you had 100 homicides, 10 of them were female victims, and 90 of them were male victims. It drops down to 10, but now 5 of them are female.
Okay, I had my
So, in other words, the female victims have fallen from 10 to 5, but the male victims have fallen from 95 to 5 in that case. So there's been a much bigger drop there. But they've both gone down.
Let's take one more question.
Have you seen any connection between literacy and violence? I always assumed there would be.
Well, it's been argued, in fact, that literacy has also has been associated with a diminishing amount of interpersonal violence. And it's been argued that it fits into Elias's model because literacy increases the ability of a person to, so to speak, self-monitor, to distance themselves psychologically from their impulses, better to think abstractly. But this, and there have been some efforts to kind of try to trace connections between literacy. The only trouble with that is sometimes there's a connection and sometimes there isn't. So there's a lot of argument going on as to how significant this is. But people have thought about that.
Okay, before we adjourn for what I think will be refreshments out in the hallway, let's thank our speaker and also our panelists once again.
Do something that may be slightly personal. I notice you have a pocket talker. Is that what that is?
Yeah, they just gave that to me.
What's the purpose of it? Does it help you to hear better?
No, it's supposed to. I don't know if it did. It's supposed to.